My best friend told me to divorce my husband because he's too ugly for me while she was literally wearing his cologne. Melissa sat in my kitchen wearing my husband's Tom Ford cologne and told me I deserved better than someone who looked like him. You're beautiful, successful, could have anyone, she said, gesturing with my coffee mug. Why settle for someone who looks like they got hit with a brick? The cologne was unmistakable. Tobacco Vanille, $350 a bottle. I bought it for James last Christmas. He wore it exactly twice, once on New Year's Eve and once to his company dinner in March. But here was Melissa, my best friend of 15 years, absolutely drenched in it on a random Thursday morning in May. I didn't say anything about the cologne, just smiled and changed the subject to her new job at the bank. She kept pushing, though, pulled up Instagram profiles of random men. Look at this guy from my gym. Investment banker, 6'3", actual jawline. Then she started listing James's supposed flaws. His crooked nose from boxing, the scar above his eyebrow, his ears that stuck out slightly, how he was only 5'9". You could do so much better, Layla. I hate seeing you waste your youth on him. What Melissa didn't know was that James and I had been trying for a baby for 3 years. IVF failed 4 times. We'd spent $80,000. Our marriage was rock solid, built on actual love, not whatever shallow garbage she was spewing. James might not be conventionally attractive, but he held my hand through every injection, every negative test, every loss. He made me laugh when I wanted to die. He learned to cook 40 different meals when depression killed my appetite. He never once complained about the cost or suggested we give up. That same night, James came home without his wedding ring, said it was getting resized. His gym bag had a receipt from Walgreens for cologne, the same cologne Melissa was wearing. I knew then, but didn't confront either of them. Instead, I started planning. See, Melissa always wanted what she couldn't have. In high school, she pursued my prom date after I mentioned I liked him. In college, she applied to my internship after I got accepted. When I got engaged, she suddenly started dating frantically, desperate to beat me to the altar. Her whole identity revolved around one-upping me. So I gave her something to really want. Started posting about how amazing James was. Not fake posts, real ones. Pictures of the surprise trip to Napa he'd booked for my birthday. The Cartier bracelet he bought when I got promoted to regional director. The handwritten letters he left on my pillow every Friday. Things that were always true, but I'd kept private before. Melissa started texting immediately. Must be nice. Some people get all the luck. He never did that before. That last text was interesting. Before what? Within a week, she was openly bitter. Complained that her boyfriend Kyle never did romantic gestures. Started asking specific questions about James's schedule, his preferences, his favorite restaurants. I answered everything honestly, knowing she was taking notes. 2 weeks later, James confessed. Broke down crying in our bedroom. Said Melissa had been pursuing him for months. Started with innocent texts about planning my surprise birthday party. Escalated to showing up at his gym, his office, the coffee shop he went to every morning. She'd told him I was cheating with my coworker Robert. Said she had proof but would only show him in person. When they met, she tried to kiss him. He pushed her away, but she'd already doused herself in his cologne from his gym bag. I'm so sorry, he sobbed. I should have told you immediately. I was scared you'd believe her over me. I held him while he cried, told him I already knew. That's when we planned the vow renewal. Not a real one, just a performance. We announced it at my company party, where Melissa was my +1. 10 years deserves celebration, I announced to 50 colleagues, especially after everything we've overcome. I made sure to mention the date, the venue, the designer dress, the $20,000 budget. Melissa's face went through 6 different emotions. The next 3 weeks were beautiful. She texted constantly, fishing for details. What time? Who's invited? What was James wearing? Where were we honeymooning? I gave her crumbs, enough to keep her hooked but never enough to satisfy. The day before the fake renewal, she broke. Called me crying. I need to tell you something about James. Oh, I said, examining my manicure. He tried to kiss me 2 months ago. I didn't want to hurt you, but you're about to renew vows with a cheater. I laughed, actually laughed. Melissa, I know about everything. The texts, the gym stalking, the cologne you stole from his bag. James told me everything. Silence. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The phone stayed quiet for so long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Melissa's voice came back shaky and wet. She asked how long I'd known, why I'd set up the whole fake vow renewal thing if I already knew everything. I told her James confessed 2 weeks ago. I needed to see exactly how far she'd go with her lies about him cheating on me. She started sobbing harder, asking if the renewal was ever real, or if I'd made the whole thing up just to mess with her. I said it was completely fake, that we never planned any actual ceremony. The venue didn't exist, and the dress I'd described was from a magazine. Every detail I'd fed her over those 3 weeks was designed to make her show her real intentions. She kept crying and asking why I couldn't just talk to her like an adult instead of playing games. I almost laughed at that, considering she'd spent months stalking my husband and lying about me cheating. Her voice changed then, got defensive and sharp. She claimed she was trying to protect me from a man who wasn't good enough for me. Said her whole pursuit of James was just testing his loyalty to see if he'd actually cheat. She insisted she never really wanted him, that she was doing me a favor by checking if he'd stay faithful. I did laugh then because the desperation in her voice made it obvious she actually wanted him and couldn't handle getting rejected. She started talking faster, saying James had been flirting with her first, that he'd encouraged her attention by being too friendly at my birthday party. I cut her off and said James told me everything about her showing up at his gym, his office, his morning coffee shop. She went quiet again for maybe 10 seconds. Then she tried a different angle, claiming I'd always been competitive with her and was twisting the situation to make her look bad. She brought up high school and college, saying I'd always acted like I was better than her. I told her our friendship was done and hung up before she could say anything else. My hands shook a little as I blocked her number in my contacts. Then I went through Instagram, Twitter, every social media platform we shared, and blocked her on all of them. The whole process took maybe 5 minutes and felt surprisingly good, like cleaning out a closet full of clothes I'd never wear again. James came home about an hour later carrying Thai food from our favorite place. He took one look at my face and asked if I'd talked to Melissa. I nodded and told him everything while we ate pad thai straight from the containers on our couch. He listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter when I described her trying to flip the story. We ended up watching 3 episodes of some terrible reality show about people buying houses they couldn't afford. James kept his arm around me the whole time and didn't mention Melissa once. The next morning, I woke up to 6 texts from Presley asking if I was okay. She said Melissa had called her last night crying about some misunderstanding between us. Presley wanted to know what happened because Melissa was being weird and wouldn't give details. I sat up in bed and scrolled back through my phone to find the screenshots James had sent me of his confession text. Then I added screenshots of the messages Melissa had sent him over the past months. The ones where she asked about his schedule, suggested meeting up, made comments about his cologne. I sent the whole collection to Presley with a message saying, this was what actually happened. She responded within 2 minutes with 4 shocked face emojis and a long text apologizing for even questioning me. She said Melissa had been fishing for information about my relationship for months now. Asked weird specific questions about whether James and I seemed happy together, if we ever fought, what his work schedule was like. Presley said she'd thought it was just normal friend curiosity, but now it seemed creepy and calculated. She asked if I needed anything or wanted to get coffee and talk. I thanked her but said I just needed some space to process losing a 15-year friendship. Over the next few days, 3 more mutual friends reached out asking what happened. Each time I realized Melissa must be calling everyone we knew trying to control the story. I decided to tell the truth to anyone who asked me directly, but I wouldn't start some campaign against her. That felt too much like high school drama, and I was 32 years old with better things to do. Jasmine from work stopped by my office on Thursday afternoon. She closed the door behind her and sat in the chair across from my desk. She said she'd always thought Melissa seemed jealous of me, but never imagined it went this far. Then she told me Melissa had made bitter comments about my Cartier bracelet at the company party. Said something about how some people got expensive jewelry while others got nothing. Jasmine also remembered Melissa asking pointed questions about the Napa trip, wanting to know if James planned it himself, or if I'd had to hint about wanting to go. I thanked Jasmine for telling me and said it helped to know other people had noticed Melissa's behavior. That evening, James came home looking uncomfortable. He said Clint from his office had pulled him aside that afternoon. Clint told him he'd seen Melissa at the gym multiple times over the past few months. She'd been waiting near James's usual workout area, always dressed up nice and wearing heavy perfume. Clint thought it was weird at the time, but figured maybe she was meeting someone there. He didn't realize she was actively pursuing James until the story came out. James looked embarrassed talking about it, like he should have noticed and done something sooner. I reminded him that Melissa was good at manipulation, and he'd handled it by rejecting her and confessing to me. A week after the phone confrontation, my cell rang with Kyle's name on the screen. I didn't answer because I figured he was calling about Melissa. James's phone buzzed a minute later with a text from Kyle asking what happened. Kyle said Melissa came home crying the night I'd confronted her and wouldn't explain why I suddenly wasn't talking to her. James looked at me and asked if he should call Kyle back. I nodded and said Kyle deserved to know his girlfriend had been pursuing another man for months. James called him and put the phone on speaker. He explained everything from the beginning, how Melissa had started with innocent texts about planning my birthday, then escalated to showing up places James went regularly. Kyle stayed quiet through the whole explanation. Then he asked if James had any proof. James sent him screenshots of Melissa's messages, including the ones where she'd tried to convince him I was cheating. Kyle thanked him for being honest and hung up. That same night around 11, my phone started ringing from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call from a different number. Then another. I listened to the first voicemail and heard Melissa begging me to call her back. She said Kyle had broken up with her, and she needed me to tell him it was all a misunderstanding. The other voicemails were similar, her voice getting more panicked each time. She called from 6 different numbers over the next 2 hours. I didn't respond to any of them. James and I sat on the couch watching her destroy herself through increasingly desperate voicemails. By the 10th call, she was screaming that I'd ruined her life over nothing, that I was a terrible friend who never really cared about her. I deleted each voicemail without listening all the way through. The next morning, I called my phone carrier and changed my number entirely. 2 weeks later, I walked into the coffee shop on Pine Street at 7:15 in the morning. James always stopped there before work to get his usual black coffee and blueberry muffin. I'd been avoiding the place since everything happened, but needed caffeine badly after a terrible night of sleep. The bell above the door jingled, and I saw her immediately. Melissa sat at the corner table near the window wearing a gray sweater and jeans. Her hair looked unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd positioned herself where she could see the door, and her eyes locked onto me the second I entered. My stomach dropped, but I kept walking toward the counter. She stood up and moved to intercept me before I could order. Her face looked puffy like she'd been crying recently. She opened her mouth, but I held up one hand and walked past her to place my order. The barista took my request for a large latte, and I paid without looking at Melissa, even though I could feel her hovering 3 feet behind me. She followed me to the pickup area and stood there wringing her hands. The barista called my name and handed me the cup. I turned to leave, but Melissa stepped directly into my path. Her eyes were red and watery, and she looked smaller somehow than I remembered. She started talking fast about how sorry she was, and how she'd been going through something mentally that made her not think clearly. The words tumbled out in a rush like she'd rehearsed them. She said therapy helped her realize she'd acted inappropriately, and she wanted to make things right between us. I sipped my latte and watched her without responding. She kept going about how our friendship meant everything to her, and she'd made terrible mistakes but hoped I could forgive her eventually. Other customers glanced over at us, and the barista pretended to wipe down the espresso machine while obviously listening. I set my cup on the counter and looked at Melissa directly for the first time. I told her that 15 years of friendship taught me she always wanted what other people had. In high school with my prom date, in college with my internship, now with my husband. She always needed to compete instead of just being happy for me. I said this time she went too far by trying to destroy my marriage with lies about James cheating. My voice stayed calm but firm, and I made sure to speak clearly so she couldn't misunderstand. Melissa's face crumpled and tears started running down her cheeks. She grabbed a napkin from the counter and pressed it against her eyes. When she looked up again, her mascara had smeared into dark circles. She said I was always the pretty one and the successful one, and she just wanted to feel special for once. She said watching me get everything while she struggled made her feel worthless. Her boyfriend Kyle never did romantic things, and seeing James treat me well made her realize what she was missing. She admitted she convinced herself that if she could just have what I had, then maybe she'd finally feel good enough. The confession hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger anymore, but sadness. Real deep sadness about wasting 15 years on someone who saw me as competition instead of a friend. I told her I understood feeling inadequate, but that didn't excuse what she did. I said I hoped she got therapy and found happiness, but we couldn't be friends anymore. Our friendship was built on her comparing herself to me, and that wasn't healthy for either of us. Melissa reached out and grabbed my arm before I could turn away. Her fingers dug into my sleeve and she pulled me back around to face her. She said James wasn't even that great, and I was making a huge mistake choosing him over her. Her voice got louder, and other customers definitely heard. She said any woman would want a man who actually looked good instead of someone with a crooked nose and ears that stuck out. The comment showed she still didn't get it at all. Loyalty and love mattered more than whatever shallow attraction she based relationships on. I pulled my arm away from her grip and picked up my latte. I walked toward the door without saying anything else. Behind me, I heard her calling my name, but I pushed through and stepped onto the sidewalk. The morning air felt cold on my face, and I took a deep breath. Something felt lighter in my chest, like I'd been carrying weight I didn't realize was there. That friendship died a long time ago, but I'd been too loyal to admit it. James's car pulled up to the curb 30 seconds later. He'd been circling the block waiting for my text. I climbed in, and he looked at my face and asked if I was okay. I nodded and told him to drive. We headed across town to a different coffee shop on Market Street that neither of us had been to before. The following week at work, I noticed people acting weird around me. Conversation stopped when I walked into the break room. Coworkers gave me sympathetic looks in the hallway. On Wednesday afternoon, Jasmine stopped by my office and closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and said she needed to tell me something. Melissa had been calling mutual friends and telling them I stole James from her. The story Melissa spread claimed she and James had been secretly dating, and I found out and seduced him away to hurt her. Jasmine said it sounded completely insane, but some people seemed to believe it, or at least weren't sure whose version to trust. I almost laughed because the lie was so ridiculous, but then realized some people might actually buy her story. Melissa was good at playing victim and crying on command. I thanked Jasmine for telling me and asked who else knew. She listed 4 names of people from our friend group. 2 of them texted me that evening asking if we could talk. I responded saying I'd explain everything but needed to do it in person with everyone together. Presley organized a dinner at her apartment for Friday night. She invited our core friend group, and I said I'd bring James, so he could explain what actually happened. 4 people showed up, which was less than I hoped but more than I feared. Presley and Jasmine already believed me. The other 2 were friends I'd known for years, but they looked uncomfortable when James and I arrived. We sat around Presley's dining table with takeout containers of Thai food. James explained the whole timeline, starting with Melissa's initial texts about planning my birthday party. He showed screenshots on his phone of her messages, including the ones where she claimed I was cheating. He described her showing up at his gym and office and the coffee shop. He explained how she tried to kiss him and he rejected her immediately, then confessed everything to me. One friend named Sarah nodded along and said it matched what she knew about Melissa's behavior patterns. The other friend named Michael stayed quiet and picked at his pad thai. After James finished talking, Michael said Melissa seemed genuinely devastated when she called him. He said her story about James leading her on sounded convincing. I pulled out my phone and showed the timeline side by side. James confessed to me 2 weeks after Melissa started pursuing him. Her stalking behavior lasted months before he told me. The screenshots proved she initiated everything and he rejected her. Michael looked at the evidence and his face changed. He apologized for doubting me and said he should have known better. Sarah squeezed my hand across the table. Michael left early saying he had work in the morning, but I could tell he felt guilty. James held my hand under the table through the rest of dinner. Presley opened wine and we talked about other things, trying to move past the awkwardness. Around 10, we said goodbye and headed home. In the car, James reminded me that people who didn't trust me after 15 years weren't really my friends anyway. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Melissa, I sat in my therapist's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I'd been seeing her for 2 years to deal with the fertility struggles and depression. She asked how I was processing everything with Melissa. I started talking about feeling relieved the friendship ended, but then my voice cracked. Tears came suddenly and I couldn't stop them. I cried, realizing I'd wasted 15 years on someone who saw me as competition rather than a true friend. Every memory felt tainted now. Every moment I thought we shared genuine connection was actually her measuring herself against me. My therapist handed me tissues and let me cry without interrupting. When I finally stopped, she asked what I learned from the experience. I said I learned that loyalty matters more than history. That some people can't be happy for you because they're too busy being unhappy with themselves. That I deserved friends who celebrated my success instead of resenting it. She nodded and said grief was appropriate even when losing something unhealthy. I was mourning the friendship I thought I had, not the one that actually existed. That distinction helped somehow. I left her office feeling wrung out but clearer than before. I drove home from my office feeling empty and somehow lighter at the same time. James was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in. He looked up from chopping vegetables and his face went soft with concern. I dropped my bag on the counter and just stood there for a minute. He put down the knife and came over to me. We ended up sitting on the couch in our living room with takeout containers of Chinese food between us. I told him everything about the therapy session and how I finally cried about losing Melissa. He listened without interrupting and held my hand across the cushions. Then he started talking about how guilty he felt for not telling me right away when Melissa first approached him. His voice cracked when he said he was scared I'd believe her lies about him cheating. He explained how she made him doubt whether I'd trust him over my best friend of 15 years. I squeezed his hand and told him I understood completely. Melissa was good at making people doubt themselves. She'd done it to me countless times over the years. We talked until midnight about our marriage and the IVF struggles and how her betrayal somehow made us stronger. He admitted he felt relieved when everything came out because keeping the secret was eating him alive. I told him we needed to promise each other we'd never keep secrets like that again, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. He nodded and pulled me close. We fell asleep on the couch, tangled together. 3 weeks later, I was at my desk reviewing quarterly reports when Presley knocked on my office door. She came in and closed it behind her, which meant she had gossip. I saved my spreadsheet and looked up. She sat down across from me and pulled out her phone. Apparently, Melissa got fired from her bank job last week. I put down my pen and asked what happened. Presley showed me screenshots from a mutual friend. Melissa had been pursuing some guy at work aggressively despite him telling her he wasn't interested. She kept showing up at his desk and texting him outside work hours and following him to lunch. He finally reported her to HR for making him uncomfortable. The bank investigated and found multiple complaints from other colleagues about her inappropriate behavior. They let her go immediately. I stared at the screenshots, feeling this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness. The pattern was so obvious now. Melissa didn't actually want James specifically. She just wanted what she couldn't have. Any man who rejected her became an obsession. I thanked Presley for telling me, and she left to get back to work. I sat there thinking about how Melissa was destroying her own life through her choices. Part of me felt vindicated that everyone could see her behavior now. But mostly I just felt sad watching someone spiral like that. That weekend, James and I sat at our kitchen table with travel websites open on my laptop. We'd been talking about actually taking a real trip together to celebrate our marriage. Not the fake vow renewal, but something genuine to reconnect after months of stress. I clicked through photos of Italy and showed him the Amalfi Coast. He leaned over my shoulder and pointed at a hotel overlooking the water. We spent 2 hours researching and planning. Finally booked 2 weeks in Italy for October. The flights and hotels cost more than we usually spent, but it felt worth it. We needed this time away from everything. James printed out the confirmation emails and stuck them on our fridge. Every time I saw them over the next few days, I felt excited about something for the first time in months. Tuesday morning, my boss called me into her office. I walked down the hall wondering if I'd messed something up on the regional reports. She was smiling when I came in, which was a good sign. She offered me the vice president position for the Western region. The promotion meant a huge salary increase, but also relocating to San Francisco. I sat there stunned for a minute. She said I could take a week to think about it and discuss with James. I thanked her and walked back to my office in a daze. Called James from my desk and told him about the offer. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said we should talk about it properly when he got home from work. That evening, we ordered pizza and spread out a map of California on our coffee table. We talked through all the pros and cons. The career advancement was incredible for me. James could probably find work at tech companies in the Bay Area, but leaving meant starting over completely. New city, new friends, new everything. We stayed up past midnight going back and forth. Finally, around 1 a.m, James said maybe we needed the fresh start. Staying here meant constantly running into Melissa or people who believed her lies. San Francisco offered us a clean break from all the social mess. I looked at him across the pizza box and realized he was right. We needed distance from this whole situation. I called my boss the next morning and accepted the promotion. 8 weeks after the confrontation with Melissa, I was working late at my desk finishing up projects before the move. My phone rang and I saw it was security downstairs. The guard said someone named Melissa was in the lobby asking to see me. My stomach dropped. I almost told him to send her away. But curiosity won. I said I'd come down for 10 minutes, took the elevator to the lobby and saw her sitting on one of the leather couches near the entrance. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back. Dark circles under her eyes. She'd lost weight in a bad way. She stood up when she saw me and her eyes filled with tears immediately. I stayed several feet away with my arms crossed. She started talking fast, saying she was so sorry and she missed me and could we please just talk. She said she needed her best friend back. I let her finish and then told her gently but firmly that I couldn't trust her anymore. Our friendship was over permanently. She started sobbing right there in the lobby. People walking by stared at us. She begged me to give her another chance. Said she was in therapy now and working on her issues. I felt genuine pity watching her fall apart. But I also felt this huge sense of relief. Walking away from this toxic dynamic was the right choice. I told her I hoped therapy helped her, but we were done. She reached for my arm and I stepped back. Told her goodbye and turned toward the elevators. She was still crying when the doors closed. I went back upstairs knowing that was probably the last time I'd ever see her. That evening, James came home from work and found me sitting on the couch surrounded by half-packed boxes. I'd already started pulling books off the shelves and wrapping our wedding photos in newspaper. He dropped his bag by the door and sat down next to me without saying anything. We just looked at each other for a minute. Then he picked up a roll of packing tape and started sealing boxes while I labeled them with a marker. We worked together until midnight, taking apart our life in this city piece by piece. Every item we packed felt like closing a door on the Melissa situation, and everything that came with it. James found the coffee mug she'd used that morning in May when this whole thing started. He held it up and asked if I wanted to keep it. I took it from him and dropped it in the trash bag. We ordered pizza around 10 and ate it sitting on the floor between stacks of boxes. James said he was excited about San Francisco, that he'd already been looking at tech companies online. I told him I was ready to leave all this drama behind and start fresh somewhere nobody knew our history. We fell asleep that night on the couch because we'd already packed our bedding. 3 months later, we drove into San Francisco on a sunny Saturday morning with all our stuff in a moving truck behind us. The city spread out in front of us with the bay sparkling blue and the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance. I felt this rush of excitement looking at it all. We found our new apartment building on a steep hill with a view of the water from our living room window. James and I spent the whole first week exploring different neighborhoods and eating at random restaurants we'd never heard of. The energy here was completely different from our old city. People seemed more focused on their own lives instead of gossiping about everyone else's business. Within 2 weeks, James got hired at a tech startup in the financial district. He came home that Friday with his offer letter, and we celebrated by taking the cable car down to the wharf and eating clam chowder while watching the sea lions. I started my VP role on a Monday morning in early September. My new office was on the 14th floor with windows overlooking the bay. The team I inherited was smaller than my old one, but everyone seemed competent and professional. During my first week, I had one-on-one meetings with each person reporting to me. Nobody asked about my personal life beyond basic small talk about where I moved from. Nobody knew about Melissa or the whole mess with James. I could just be the new VP without carrying all that social baggage. The relief of that was huge. I could focus completely on work without wondering if people were whispering about me or taking sides. My boss took me to lunch that first Friday and told me she was impressed with how quickly I was getting up to speed. I thanked her and meant it because this job opportunity had given me an escape route from a toxic situation. James and I found a fertility clinic in the Marina District that specialized in difficult cases. The doctor there was a woman in her 50s who'd done research on why some people don't respond well to standard IVF protocols. She reviewed all our medical records from the past 3 years and the 4 failed attempts. Then she explained there was a different approach we could try that adjusted the medication dosages based on daily blood tests instead of a fixed schedule. She said it was more intensive and required coming in every morning for monitoring, but the success rates for people like us were better. James and I sat in her office looking at the statistics she showed us. The numbers were encouraging, but we'd been disappointed so many times before. She told us to take a few weeks to think about it and decide if we wanted to try again. We spent the next month talking through whether to do another IVF round or start looking into adoption. James researched adoption agencies and foster care programs online. He made spreadsheets comparing different options and their requirements. I appreciated that he was planning for both possibilities instead of putting all our hopes on one path. We finally decided to try the new protocol one more time because we'd always wonder if it might have worked. But we also agreed that if this round failed, we'd pursue adoption seriously, instead of continuing with more IVF. James found 3 adoption agencies in the Bay Area and requested information packets from all of them. Having that backup plan made the decision to try again feel less desperate. We weren't gambling everything on this one attempt. We were giving ourselves one more chance at biological parenthood while acknowledging other paths to building our family. 4 months after we left our old city, Presley flew out to visit us for a long weekend. I picked her up from the airport on a Friday afternoon, and we drove back to our apartment through rush hour traffic. She loved our place and spent 20 minutes taking photos of the view from our balcony. That night over dinner at a Thai restaurant in our neighborhood, she told me what had been happening back home. Melissa had moved back to her hometown in Ohio after getting evicted from her apartment. Apparently, she'd been fired from the bank job months ago, but kept pretending she still worked there. She'd also lost most of her remaining friends after they found out she'd been pursuing another married man from her gym. Presley said the pattern just kept repeating itself until people got tired of the drama and cut her off. She'd tried to reach out to Presley several times asking about me and James, but Presley never responded. Hearing all this made me feel strange. Part of me felt sad that someone I'd known for 15 years had basically destroyed her own life. But another part of me recognized that these were consequences of Melissa's own choices. Presley and I spent Saturday walking around Fisherman's Wharf and riding the cable cars like tourists. We got coffee at this place overlooking the water and talked about everything except Melissa. She told me about her new relationship with a guy from her company and how different it felt to be with someone emotionally available. I told her about my new job and how much I loved living here. Sunday, we drove across the Golden Gate Bridge to Sausalito and had lunch at a restaurant on the water. On the drive back, Presley said she was really happy for me and James, that we seemed more relaxed and settled than we'd been in years. I realized she was right. Getting away from all that social mess had let us focus on our actual relationship instead of defending it constantly. When I dropped Presley at the airport Sunday evening, I felt grateful to have a friend who actually supported me instead of competing with me. 6 weeks after starting the new IVF protocol, I woke up on a Tuesday morning and took a pregnancy test before James got up. I'd been taking them every few days, even though the clinic said to wait. This time, 2 lines appeared almost immediately. I sat on the bathroom floor staring at it for a full minute before I could even process what I was seeing. Then I started crying so hard I had to put my hand over my mouth to stay quiet. James knocked on the bathroom door asking if I was okay. I opened it and just held up the test. His face went through about 5 different expressions before he started crying too. We stood there in our bathroom at 6 in the morning, hugging each other and crying. After 3 years of trying and 4 failed attempts and $80,000 spent, this was actually happening. James called his work and said he'd be late. We went to the clinic that morning for a blood test to confirm it. The results came back that afternoon showing hormone levels that indicated a healthy early pregnancy. The nurse who called with the results sounded genuinely happy for us because she'd been monitoring me every morning for weeks. My first trimester was rough in ways I hadn't expected. The nausea started around week 6 and never really stopped. I couldn't keep food down most mornings and lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks. James started working from home 2 days a week so he could help me. He'd make me ginger tea and bring me crackers in bed before I even tried to sit up. He took over all the cooking and cleaning because the smell of most foods made me sick. I felt guilty watching him do everything while I spent most evenings lying on the couch feeling terrible. But he never complained once. He'd sit next to me rubbing my back and telling me it would get better soon. His devotion during those weeks reminded me why Melissa's criticism of his appearance had been so ridiculous. She'd focused on his crooked nose and his height while completely missing that his character was genuinely beautiful. He showed up for me every single day without expecting anything in return. At 12 weeks, we went for the ultrasound that would tell us if everything was developing normally. The technician spread gel on my stomach and moved the wand around for a minute. Then she got quiet and moved it to a different spot. My heart started racing because I thought something was wrong. She turned the screen toward us and pointed at 2 distinct shapes. James grabbed my hand so hard it hurt. The technician smiled and said we were having twins. The doctor came in a few minutes later and explained that the specific protocol we'd used sometimes resulted in multiple embryos implanting. She checked both heartbeats and said everything looked healthy. James started laughing in this slightly hysterical way. He said we were getting our whole family at once after waiting so long. I couldn't stop staring at the ultrasound images showing 2 tiny shapes that would become our children. We drove home in a daze and spent the rest of the day just sitting on our couch processing the news that we were having twins. I started noticing around January that Melissa didn't cross my mind anymore during regular days. I'd be making coffee or walking to work and realize she hadn't popped into my thoughts at all. The anger had faded first, back in December when we were still unpacking boxes. Then the hurt started dissolving bit by bit, until it became this distant thing that happened to someone else. By February, I could go whole weeks without remembering she existed. The 3,000 miles between us made the emotional distance easier to handle. I couldn't accidentally run into her at the grocery store or see her car parked outside places we used to go together. She became this ghost from my old life that didn't have any power over my new one. James noticed the change before I did. He mentioned one morning that I seemed lighter, like I'd put down something heavy I'd been carrying. He was right. The friendship ending had hurt worse than I wanted to admit, even knowing how toxic it was. 15 years of history doesn't just disappear because someone betrays you. But the physical space helped me see clearly that keeping her in my life would have slowly poisoned everything good I had. My doctor mentioned a support group for women dealing with infertility issues during one of my checkups in late February. I almost didn't go because talking about feelings with strangers sounded terrible. But something made me show up to the community center on a Thursday night where 8 women sat in a circle sharing their stories. The first meeting broke something open in me that I'd been keeping sealed tight. Hearing other women describe the exact same grief and frustration and anger I'd felt during our failed attempts made me realize how alone I'd been trying to process it all. I started going every week and eventually began sharing my own story about the 4 failed rounds and the $80,000 we'd spent, and the depression that came with every negative test. Other women nodded while I talked, because they understood that specific kind of loss in a way most people couldn't. One woman had tried for 6 years, another had given up entirely after 7 rounds. Their strength helped me recognize my own. By March, I was helping newer members process their feelings, and offering the same support others had given me. Sharing what I'd been through gave it meaning beyond just my own pain. If talking about my experience helped even one woman feel less alone in her struggle, then maybe all that suffering had served some kind of purpose. James surprised me in early April with a baby moon trip to Napa Valley before I got too big to travel comfortably. We drove up on a Saturday morning and checked into this beautiful bed and breakfast surrounded by vineyards. I couldn't drink the wine, obviously, but we did tours and ate incredible food, and spent hours just talking about everything that had changed in the past 6 months. We both agreed that Melissa's betrayal, as painful as it was, had pushed us toward changes we probably needed anyway. The move to San Francisco forced us out of our comfortable routine and made us rebuild our social life from scratch. That process helped us appreciate what we had together instead of taking it for granted. James said he'd been coasting for years, going through the motions at his old job without any real passion for the work. His new position challenged him in ways that made him excited about his career again. I felt the same about my VP role. The promotion gave me opportunities I never would have had staying in our old city. We spent Sunday morning lying in bed watching the sunrise over the vineyards and acknowledging that sometimes the worst things that happen end up leading to the best outcomes. Neither of us would have chosen the Melissa situation, but we couldn't deny that our lives were genuinely better now than they'd been before everything exploded. My belly grew steadily bigger through May and June as I moved into the third trimester. We spent weekends setting up the nursery in our second bedroom, painting the walls a soft yellow that worked for both a boy and girl. James assembled 2 cribs while I organized tiny clothes by size in the dresser drawers. We'd gotten so many gifts from my work shower and his family that we had enough outfits to change the babies 3 times a day for a month. Every time I folded another onesie or arranged another stuffed animal, the reality of actually becoming parents hit me fresh. We'd wanted this for so long that part of me still couldn't believe it was actually happening. James would catch me standing in the nursery just staring at the 2 cribs and come wrap his arms around me from behind. We'd stand there together imagining what it would be like when the room was full of crying babies and dirty diapers and 3 a.m. feedings. The excitement mixed with pure terror in equal measure. Neither of us had any idea what we were doing, but at least we were going into it together as a team. The email from Melissa arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, 7 months after our phone confrontation. I saw her name in my inbox and almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. The message was long, several paragraphs apologizing again for everything she'd done and explaining she'd been in therapy since October working on her jealousy and competition issues. She wrote about how she'd spent her whole life comparing herself to other people and feeling like she was never enough. Her therapist helped her see that pursuing James wasn't really about him at all, but about this desperate need to prove she could have what I had. She talked about recognizing patterns from her childhood, where her older sister always got more attention and praise. The email went deep into her realization that she'd built her entire identity around one-upping me instead of figuring out who she actually was as a person. She didn't ask me to forgive her or be friends again. She just wanted me to know she was trying to change and become someone better. The tone felt genuine in a way her previous apologies hadn't. She sounded like someone who'd done real work examining her own behavior instead of just saying sorry to make herself feel better. I read the email twice, sitting at my desk with my hand on my belly feeling the baby's kick. Part of me felt vindicated that she'd acknowledged how messed up her behavior was. Another part felt sad for the years we'd wasted on a friendship built on such a broken foundation. I thought about not responding at all, but that felt cruel after she'd been so honest about her struggles. I wrote back briefly that I appreciated her letting me know about her therapy progress and wished her well in her personal growth. But I made clear that our friendship wouldn't be rekindled regardless of how much work she did on herself. Too much damage had been done and too much time had passed for us to go back to any kind of relationship. The closure felt good, though, like we were both finally moving forward on our own paths instead of staying stuck in the past. I closed my laptop and went back to work, feeling lighter than I had since her name first appeared in my inbox. Whatever healing she needed to do was her own journey now, separate from mine. My team threw me a shower at the office when I hit 36 weeks and went on maternity leave in mid-July. They decorated the conference room with balloons and streamers and piled a table high with wrapped gifts. My boss gave a speech about how valuable I'd been to the company and how excited everyone was for me to become a mom. I opened presents while eating cake and laughing at the ridiculous baby advice people kept offering. Someone bought us a book called The Baby Owner's Manual that treated infants like you were assembling furniture. Another coworker gave us a onesie that said, "I just spent 9 months inside my mom. And even I think her job is harder than yours." The gifts were generous and thoughtful, everything from practical items like bottles and burp cloths to luxuries like a fancy baby monitor and designer diaper bag. But what struck me most was how genuine the relationships felt. These people had known me less than a year, but they showed up with real enthusiasm and support. It proved I could build healthy friendships when I wasn't tolerating toxic ones. I'd spent 15 years accepting Melissa's competitive behavior as normal because that's all I knew. Now I had colleagues who celebrated my success instead of resenting it, who offered help without expecting something in return, who genuinely cared about my well-being. The contrast made me realize how low my standards had been for friendship before. James and I started a childbirth class for parents of multiples in early August. We went every Tuesday evening and sat with 5 other couples who were all having twins. The instructor taught us breathing techniques and labor positions and how to handle 2 babies at once. I watched James during every class, noticing how engaged he was compared to some other partners there. He asked questions about pain management and took detailed notes about swaddling techniques. One guy spent half the class on his phone while his wife looked ready to murder him. Another kept making jokes about how tired he was going to be, like his wife wasn't about to push two humans out of her body. Melissa's claim that I could do better seemed even more ridiculous watching these other relationships up close. Better than what exactly? Better than a man who showed up fully present and eager to learn how to take care of our children? Better than someone who held my hand during every contraction exercise and didn't complain once about the time commitment? I squeezed James's hand during a particularly intense breathing exercise and felt grateful all over again that I'd seen through Melissa's shallow criticism. His crooked nose and average height meant nothing compared to his character and devotion. The twins arrived 3 weeks later at 37 weeks, right on schedule for multiples. My water broke at 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and we rushed to the hospital with our packed bags. Labor lasted 14 hours, which the doctor said was actually pretty fast for twins. James stayed by my side the entire time, letting me squeeze his hand until I probably left bruises. He wiped my face with cold washcloths and fed me ice chips and told me I was doing great even when I was screaming that I wanted drugs immediately. Our son was born first at 4:23 p.m., weighing 6 pounds 2 ounces. Our daughter followed 8 minutes later at 4:31 p.m., weighing 5 pounds 9 ounces. Both of them came out screaming and pink and absolutely perfect. The nurses cleaned them up and handed them to James while the doctor finished with me. I watched him hold both babies against his chest, one in each arm, with tears streaming down his face. He looked at them like they were the most precious things he'd ever seen in his life. I grabbed my phone and took a photo of that moment, capturing the pure love and joy on his face. That picture became my phone background for the next year. Every time I looked at it, I remembered why our marriage had survived everything it went through. The first month home was complete chaos in the best and worst ways possible. The babies ate every 2 hours around the clock, which meant neither James nor I slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch. We took shifts so one person could get a solid 4-hour block while the other handled both babies. Our living room turned into a disaster zone of burp cloths and bottles and dirty onesies. I leaked milk constantly despite nursing pads. James walked around like a zombie most days, functioning on pure caffeine and determination. We both cried from exhaustion multiple times. But we worked as a team, dividing responsibilities without keeping score or complaining about who was doing more. When I had a breakdown at 3 a.m. because our daughter wouldn't stop crying, James took her and walked laps around our apartment until she finally fell asleep. When he looked ready to collapse after a particularly brutal night, I told him to go sleep in our bedroom with earplugs while I handled the morning feeding. His patience during those brutal weeks reminded me exactly why our marriage survived the Melissa situation. He showed up every single day with humor and love even when we were both running on fumes. We'd built something strong enough to weather betrayal and cross-country moves, and now the absolute chaos of newborn twins. Nothing about those first weeks was easy, but I couldn't imagine going through it with anyone else. Nothing about those first weeks was easy, but I couldn't imagine going through it with anyone else. 6 weeks after the twins were born, I was changing diapers on our living room floor when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained 3 photos of a social media post showing Melissa in a white dress standing next to some guy I'd never seen before. The caption read something about being engaged and finding her soulmate. I looked at the pictures for maybe 10 seconds, felt a weird, detached curiosity like seeing news about someone I used to know in high school, then deleted the message and went back to wiping our daughter's bottom. James walked in carrying grocery bags and asked who texted. I told him it was Melissa's engagement announcement from a random number. He stopped putting away milk and looked at me with concern, probably expecting me to be upset or angry. I just shrugged and said I felt nothing about it, which was completely true. The woman in those photos felt like a stranger whose drama happened in a different lifetime. We took the twins for their 2-month checkup on a Tuesday morning in late September. The pediatrician measured their heads in length, checked their reflexes, and told us both babies were hitting all their milestones perfectly. Our son weighed 13 pounds now, and our daughter was 11 and a half. The doctor said their growth curves looked excellent, and their development was right on track. Driving home with both car seats secured in the back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at their sleeping faces. James reached over and squeezed my hand while waiting at a red light. I felt this overwhelming wave of gratitude for how everything turned out, for the healthy babies in our back seat and the husband beside me who never gave up during 3 years of trying. The fertility struggles and Melissa's betrayal and all that pain felt worth it somehow, because it led us here to this exact moment. 3 months after the twins were born, I went back to work part-time on a flexible schedule that let me work from home 3 days a week. James adjusted his hours at the tech company so he could leave early and handle afternoon feedings and naps. Our new arrangement worked surprisingly well once we figured out the rhythm. I discovered I actually enjoyed the balance between my career and being home with the babies. Working kept my brain sharp and gave me adult conversations, but I also got to be present for most of their daily routines. James turned out to be amazing at the stay-at-home parent stuff, way more patient with crying and diaper blowouts than I was. He'd send me photos during the day of the twins napping on his chest or making funny faces. Watching him embrace fatherhood so completely made me fall in love with him all over again in a different way. Presley flew up from our old city in November to meet the twins and stay for a long weekend. She showed up at our apartment with 2 massive shopping bags full of designer baby clothes that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. She spent an hour holding both babies and taking approximately 700 photos. Over coffee while the twins napped, she mentioned she'd seen Melissa's engagement announcement online. She said the whole thing seemed rushed and the guy looked uncomfortable in all the photos, like he wasn't totally sure about getting married. I told her honestly that I didn't care enough to discuss it further. Presley smiled and said that was probably the healthiest response possible. She talked about her own life instead, a new promotion at work, and a guy she'd been dating for a few months. Having a friend who could visit without bringing up drama or taking sides felt refreshing, and made me realize how toxic my friendship with Melissa had actually been. James and I celebrated our 11th wedding anniversary in December, with a nice dinner at an Italian restaurant downtown, while my parents drove up to babysit the twins overnight. We sat across from each other with wine and pasta and reflected on everything we'd been through together over the past year. The fertility struggles that finally ended with success. Melissa's betrayal and the painful end of that friendship. The cross-country move to San Francisco. Becoming parents to twins. All of it had made our marriage incredibly strong in ways I didn't think were possible. James told me he'd never been prouder of how I handled the Melissa situation with Grace instead of getting petty or mean. I told him his support during our IVF attempts and his devotion as a father proved Melissa's criticism of him was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. We held hands across the table and I felt certain we could handle whatever life threw at us next. Sitting in my office one afternoon in January, I realized I'd built a completely new life in San Francisco. I had genuine friends through work and our neighborhood who knew us as we are now, not as the couple dealing with fertility issues or friendship drama. My career was thriving in ways it hadn't back in our old city. We had the family we fought so hard to create. The toxic friendship with Melissa felt like it happened to a different person in a different lifetime, like watching a movie about someone else's life. I couldn't even remember why I'd stayed friends with her for so long when the pattern of competition and jealousy was so obvious looking back. When the twins were 4 months old, we flew to visit James's family for the holidays. His parents and siblings immediately fell in love with both babies, passing them around and fighting over who got to hold them next. His mom pulled me aside on Christmas Eve while everyone else was in the living room. She told me she was proud of how I handled the Melissa situation with grace and strength, that a lot of people would have made it ugly in public. She said she always knew I was the right person for James because I saw his character instead of judging him on superficial stuff. Her words made me tear up a little because I'd been worried his family might have heard Melissa's version of events. Back in San Francisco after the holidays, I was grabbing coffee near my office when I ran into someone from our old city, whose face looked familiar, but I couldn't place immediately. She recognized me first and came over to say hi. Turned out she worked with someone on my old team. We made small talk for a few minutes before she mentioned she'd heard Melissa's engagement ended badly right before Christmas. Apparently her fiancé found out about her pattern of pursuing unavailable men and called off the wedding. I felt brief sympathy for Melissa because that must have been humiliating, but mostly I felt relief that I wasn't caught up in her drama anymore. The woman seemed surprised when I said I hadn't talked to Melissa in almost a year. She clearly expected me to have all the gossip. I finished my coffee and went back to work, grateful all over again for the physical distance between my new life and that mess. James and I started planning the twins' first birthday party 6 months in advance, excited to celebrate this huge milestone after years of wondering if we'd ever become parents at all. We decided on a small gathering at our apartment with our new friend group in San Francisco, people who knew us as we are now rather than who we used to be. James wanted a dinosaur theme and I wanted something with balloons, so we compromised on dinosaurs with lots of colorful balloons. We spent evenings looking at cake designs and party decorations, laughing about how we were probably going overboard for babies who wouldn't even remember it. But after everything we'd been through to get here, we wanted to celebrate big. 9 months after moving to San Francisco, my boss called me into her office and offered me a promotion to senior vice president overseeing the entire West Coast region. The position came with a significant raise and more responsibility, managing teams in 3 states. I accepted immediately, feeling like the career advancement validated my decision to take the risk of relocating. James was incredibly supportive when I told him that night, saying he was proud of me and we'd figure out the childcare logistics together. The promotion meant our family was financially secure in ways we hadn't been during the fertility treatments. It also proved I could rebuild my career in a new city and actually thrive instead of just surviving. We interviewed 3 candidates for the nanny position and hired a woman named Carmen who had 10 years of experience with twins. She started the following Monday, coming to our apartment at 7 each morning so I could get ready for work without rushing. The cost was significant, almost $2,000 a month, but James and I agreed it was worth it to keep my career moving forward, while still having time with the babies in the evenings. Carmen was patient and warm with both twins, and within a week they were comfortable with her handling their feedings and naps. I accepted the senior vice president promotion officially and started my new responsibilities managing teams across California, Oregon, and Washington. The job required more travel than before, but I planned trips carefully around the twins' schedules and Carmen's availability. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, I sat at our kitchen table drinking coffee while James played with the twins on the living room floor. He was making silly faces and they were both giggling, their little hands reaching up toward him. I watched them together and felt something shift inside me, a quiet recognition that I was actually happy in a way I hadn't been before everything happened with Melissa. The betrayal had forced me to look at my life clearly and figure out what actually mattered instead of just going through the motions. I had a husband who made our babies laugh, a career I worked hard to build, and real friends who supported us. The toxic friendship I lost had been holding me back from appreciating what I already had. The twins started sleeping through the night consistently when they were 7 months old, and suddenly James and I had evenings to ourselves again after they went down at 7. We would sit on our couch with wine and actually talk like we used to before the babies arrived. One night we were discussing our finances and realized we were in better shape than we'd been in years, even with the nanny expense. James mentioned maybe trying for another baby in a few years, and I laughed at how different our situation was now, compared to the years of failed fertility treatments. We went from struggling to have 1 child to considering a 3rd, and the irony wasn't lost on either of us. A year after the confrontation with Melissa, I moved into my new corner office with windows overlooking the bay. I put up photos of James and the twins on my desk, right where I could see them whenever I looked up from my computer. Sitting there that first morning, I felt grateful for how everything worked out in a way I hadn't expected. The friendship I lost was holding me back from recognizing the genuine love and success I already had, and walking away from that toxicity opened space for real happiness and growth that I didn't know was possible. My best friend demanded 50% of my $12 million company sale for being my emotional support, so I offered her exactly what she gave me: nothing. Me and Haley had been best friends since middle school. We did everything together, survived high school drama, picked the same college, even lived together junior year. After graduation, she got a marketing job at a big firm making decent money while I waited tables and worked on my business idea at night. I was developing this app that connected local farmers with restaurants, cutting out distributors and saving both sides money. Haley would listen to me talk about it over wine, nodding while scrolling her phone. She'd say it sounded cool, then change the subject to her work drama or whatever guy she was dating. I spent 2 years building this thing, teaching myself to code from YouTube videos, cold calling farms at 5 in the morning before my lunch shift, begging restaurants to try the beta version. I lived on ramen and eggs, wore the same 3 outfits, skipped everything fun to save money for server costs. Haley would complain I was boring now and never wanted to go out. She'd invite me to expensive brunches, then act hurt when I ordered water and the cheapest appetizer. When I finally launched, I had 12 farms and 8 restaurants signed up. Small, but it was working. The app started getting attention from local food bloggers. A tech investor reached out after his wife saw an article. Within 6 months, I had funding and could quit waitressing. Haley threw me a congratulations dinner at her place, made a big toast about how proud she was, posted photos everywhere calling me her CEO best friend. The business exploded after that. 200 farms in 3 states, major restaurant chains signing contracts, features in industry magazines. I hired a team, got office space, started paying myself an actual salary. Haley would drop by the office during her lunch breaks, telling everyone how she'd been there from the beginning, how she'd supported me through everything. She started calling herself my unofficial advisor on social media. Then came the acquisition offer. A major tech company wanted to buy the platform for $12 million. Not life-changing money after investor payouts and taxes, but enough to set me up nice and fund my next venture. I told Haley at dinner, excited to share the news with my oldest friend. She congratulated me, we drank champagne, everything seemed normal. 2 days later, Haley showed up at my office with a man in a suit. She introduced him as her attorney and said they needed to discuss her equity stake before the sale went through. I laughed, thinking it was a weird joke. It wasn't. Haley sat across from my desk and explained that she'd been my emotional support system during the building phase, my sounding board, my unofficial consultant. She'd sacrificed nights out to listen to my problems, given me advice on logo colors, even helped me pick the company name during a drunk conversation I barely remembered. Her lawyer had paperwork showing she deserved 50% based on her contributions as a founding advisor. I asked if she was serious. She said best friends who build something together should share the success. I reminded her she had a full-time job the entire time while I worked 80-hour weeks. She said emotional labor was still labor. I asked what specific work she'd done for the company. She listened to me vent, encouraging me when I wanted to quit, and was present during my journey. Her lawyer actually nodded like this was legitimate. I told them both to get out. Haley started crying, saying I was choosing money over friendship, that she'd believed in me when no one else did. She posted everywhere that I'd betrayed her after everything she'd sacrificed to support my dream. Mutual friends started texting, asking why I was being so cold to Haley. Some said she had a point about emotional support being valuable. Her mom called my mom, saying I'd broken her daughter's heart. That's when I decided to give Haley exactly what she'd earned. I pulled every text exchange we'd had during those 2 years. Hundreds of messages where I'd share updates about the business, and she'd respond with K or cool before sending 20 texts about her dating life. Found the emails where I'd begged her to review my business plan, and she'd never opened the attachments. The voice memos where I'd asked for feedback, and she'd say she was too tired from real work to think about my hobby. I compiled it all into a document showing her actual contribution, which was 0. Then I calculated the fair market value of emotional support. Turns out therapists charge about $200 an hour. Haley had maybe listened to me talk about the business for 40 hours total over 2 years, being generous. $8,000 of emotional support if we're calling it professional services. I had my lawyer draft an offer. $8,000 for her contributions as an emotional support consultant, contingent on her signing away any future claims to the company. Sent it to her lawyer with my documentation of her actual involvement, which was nothing. Her lawyer called back, and what he said made me laugh. He actually laughed and said his client would accept the $8,000 plus an additional $2 million as a good faith settlement to avoid litigation. I told him to go ahead and file whatever lawsuit he wanted because I had receipts for days. He went quiet for a second, probably not expecting me to call his bluff, then said he'd be in touch and hung up. I sat at my desk staring at my phone, hands shaking from anger more than fear. $2 million on top of $8,000 for doing literally nothing. The nerve of it made my skin hot. My attorney called that evening sounding almost excited. She explained that Haley's legal position was so weak that any judge with half a brain would throw it out immediately. She said we should let them file so we could countersue for legal fees and harassment. The way she said it made me think she actually wanted this fight, like she was tired of seeing people get away with shakedown attempts disguised as friendship. I asked if this would mess up the acquisition, and she promised it wouldn't, said frivolous lawsuits happen all the time in business deals, and the acquiring company would understand. I wanted to believe her, but my stomach still felt tight. I spent the next 2 days going through 6 years of friendship with different eyes, seeing all the moments where Haley made everything about her. Every celebration of mine became her photo opportunity. My app launch party turned into her chance to network and hand out business cards. My first investor meeting that I was nervous about got 3 texts of support from her, followed by 40 texts about some guy who didn't text her back. Every struggle of mine became background noise to her dating drama or work complaints. I found old journal entries where I'd written about feeling alone even though I had a best friend, not understanding why I felt that way. Now I understood. She was never actually there. The mutual friend texts got worse. People I barely talked to anymore were suddenly messaging me demanding I just give her something to keep the peace. They said it wasn't worth losing a friendship over money, that I was being stubborn and cold. I started screenshotting every message where they put Haley's feelings over the fact that she was literally trying to steal millions from me. One girl I knew from college wrote this long text about how success changes people, and maybe I should remember where I came from. I wanted to write back that I came from waiting tables and eating ramen, not from Haley's couch, but I didn't. I just took the screenshot and added it to my growing collection of people showing their true colors. My tech investor called sounding worried about the acquisition timeline and whether this legal threat would mess up the sale. I told him my attorney said it was frivolous and wouldn't impact anything, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I could hear the concern in his voice, though, that careful tone people use when they're trying not to panic you, but they're definitely concerned. He asked if I needed anything, and I said no, just wanted to get through this and close the deal. After we hung up, I sat in my office wondering if Haley realized she wasn't just coming after me, she was potentially hurting my team and investors and everyone who actually helped build this company. Haley posted a long Instagram story about fake friends who forget where they came from and people who change when they get money. She didn't name me, but it was obvious. The whole thing was written like she was some victim of my success, like I'd betrayed her by not handing over half of everything I built. Within an hour, dozens of people who barely knew either of us were commenting their support for her. Heart emojis and comments about how she deserved better, how real friends stick together, how money reveals people's true nature. I watched the comments pile up feeling sick, seeing how easy it was for her to spin this story when most people didn't know the truth. I wanted to respond publicly so bad. I wanted to post all my documentation, every ignored text and unopened email, every time she made my business into background noise for her life. But I didn't. Instead, I sent my full documentation to the 5 friends I actually trusted, the ones who'd been there during the hard years and knew the real story. Their responses came back fast, shocked and angry on my behalf. One friend said she always thought Haley was self-centered, but never realized how bad it was. Another said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. Reading their messages made me feel less alone, like maybe I wasn't crazy for being mad about this. My mom called upset because Haley's mom wouldn't stop texting her about how I'd broken her daughter's heart over money. I had to walk my mom through the actual situation because Haley's version was apparently that we built the business together as equal partners. My mom kept saying she didn't understand how Haley could claim that when she had a full-time job the whole time. I explained about the lawyer and the 50% demand and the $2 million settlement counteroffer. My mom got quiet and then said she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said she raised me to be fair, but also to not be a doormat, and giving away millions to someone who did nothing wasn't fair to anyone. My attorney sent a formal response to Haley's lawyer laying out exactly why his client had no legal claim. She included a detailed breakdown of my solo work building the company, with dates and documentation. Bank statements showing I paid all expenses. Server logs showing I did all the coding. Email chains with restaurants and farms that only had my name on them. Calendar records of my 80-hour work weeks. She added that we were prepared to pursue all available remedies if they proceeded with frivolous litigation, which I knew meant countersuing for legal fees and harassment. Reading the response made me feel powerful for the first time since this started, like I had proof of reality instead of just Haley's made-up story. 3 days later, Haley's lawyer filed a lawsuit anyway claiming breach of oral contract, unjust enrichment, and quantum meruit. My attorney was right that it was legally weak, but seeing my former best friend actually sue me still felt like getting punched. The filing came through email, and I sat reading these legal words that basically said I'd stolen from her, that I owed her millions, that our friendship meant I had to share everything I built. My hands were shaking holding my phone. Part of me kept thinking this couldn't be real, that Haley would come to her senses and drop it. But the lawsuit was real, and she wasn't backing down. The acquiring company's legal team called the next morning, and I spent 2 hours on a conference call explaining the entire situation. Their general counsel kept asking if there was any written agreement, any email where I promised equity, any documentation that might give weight to her claims. I walked them through my evidence folder showing hundreds of text messages where she barely responded to business updates, emails she never opened, voice memos where she said she was too tired to think about my hobby. The head lawyer sounded relieved by the end and told me to keep them updated, but this looked like a nuisance suit that wouldn't affect the acquisition. Still, I could hear the concern underneath his words, and knew they were worried about complications derailing their $12 million deal. My attorney called that afternoon to tell me she'd filed our response. She sounded almost excited as she explained that we weren't just denying the claims, but hitting back with a counterclaim for legal fees, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She said we were going nuclear because people like Haley needed to learn there were consequences for trying to shake down their successful friends. The counterclaim laid out how Haley had a full-time marketing job during the entire period she claimed to be building my company, how she never contributed work product or business expertise, how she was now trying to extort millions through baseless legal threats. Reading through the filing made me feel powerful and scared at the same time, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But Haley had crossed that line first when she showed up with her lawyer demanding half my company. 3 weeks later, I sat in a conference room for my deposition with Haley's lawyer, asking me detailed questions about every conversation we'd ever had about the business. He wanted to know about the night she supposedly helped me pick the company name, about times she'd given me advice on marketing or strategy, about her emotional support during hard times. I answered honestly that most conversations about my business involved me talking while she scrolled her phone or changed the subject to her dating life. When he asked about specific advice she'd given, I explained that she'd occasionally said things sounded cool, but never offered concrete business input. I watched his face change as he realized his client had lied about her level of involvement, his questions getting shorter and less confident as the deposition went on. By the end, he was just going through the motions, and I could tell he knew he was representing someone trying to steal from their friend. My attorney called me the following week after Haley's deposition. sounding satisfied in a way that told me things had gone badly for the other side. She said Haley couldn't name a single specific contribution beyond being there and believing in me when pressed for concrete examples. When asked what work product she'd created for the company, Haley apparently said that emotional labor was work product. When asked how many hours she'd spent on business tasks, she couldn't give a number. When asked to describe her role in the company, she said she was the emotional support consultant and sounding board. My attorney said the court reporter was barely hiding her reactions, and Haley's own lawyer looked uncomfortable by the end. She told me we had everything we needed to get this dismissed, and probably win our counterclaim for fees. 2 mutual friends reached out to apologize after the legal filings became semi-public through the friend group. They admitted they'd only heard Haley's version where she made it sound like you'd built the business together as partners, and I'd cut her out when the money came. Seeing the actual legal documents where she claimed to be a founding advisor despite having a different full-time job the whole time made them realize how much she'd lied. One friend said she felt stupid for not questioning Haley's story more carefully, since everyone knew she'd been working at the marketing firm during those years. The other friend said she was horrified that Haley would actually sue me over something so obviously false and wondered what else Haley had lied about over the years. Their apologies felt good, but also made me sad that it took legal documents for people to believe me over her Victim Act. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing 6 weeks out to address what the filing called the obviously frivolous nature of the claims. My attorney was confident we'd get most of it dismissed immediately since Haley had no evidence of any agreement or actual business contribution. But she warned me that even with a weak case, the process still meant months of my life consumed by this legal battle. Court dates and lawyer meetings and constant stress about what Haley might claim next. The acquisition was moving forward, but I had to disclose the lawsuit to the acquiring company and watch their lawyers get nervous about potential complications. Every day felt like carrying extra weight knowing my former best friend was actively trying to steal millions from me through the legal system. I threw myself into work to avoid thinking about the lawsuit, focusing on the acquisition transition and making sure my team was taken care of. I spent long hours documenting processes and training the acquiring company's staff on the platform systems. Several employees pulled me aside to say they were disgusted by what Haley was doing because they'd seen how hard I worked to build this company. One developer said he remembered me sleeping in the office during the early days, while Haley posted Instagram stories from fancy brunches. Another employee said she'd met Haley a few times when she stopped by the office and always thought it was weird how she acted like she was part of the company when she clearly worked somewhere else. Their support helped but couldn't completely erase the stress of knowing someone was trying to destroy what I'd built. Haley's social media campaign continued with vague posts about betrayal and people showing their true colors when money gets involved. She posted quotes about fake friends and loyalty and standing up for yourself against people who use you. I noticed she'd lost some followers but gained others who loved drama and left supportive comments without knowing the actual situation. The whole thing felt like she was performing victimhood for an audience, crafting a narrative where she was the wronged friend instead of someone trying to steal millions. Part of me wanted to respond and share my side publicly, but my attorney said that would only make things worse and feed into Haley's victim story. So I stayed quiet and watched her build this false narrative while I had legal documents proving the truth. My attorney discovered that Haley's lawyer was working on contingency after doing some research into his practice. That meant he only got paid if they won or settled, usually taking a third of whatever Haley received. She explained this was why he'd filed despite the weak case since he was basically gambling that I'd settle to avoid hassle and legal fees. If he could scare me into paying even a few $100,000 to make it go away, he'd walk away with a nice chunk of money for minimal work. My attorney said these kinds of lawyers prey on successful people's desire to avoid drama and litigation costs. But we weren't settling because giving in would just encourage more people to try shaking down their friends with bogus lawsuits. The preliminary hearing finally arrived, and I sat in the courtroom watching the judge read through the filings looking increasingly annoyed. He asked Haley's lawyer to explain what specific work product or business contribution his client provided to justify a claim for half the company. The lawyer's answer was rambling nonsense about emotional labor and friendship and being present during the journey and how modern business relationships include non-traditional contributions. The judge cut him off and asked for concrete examples of work performed, contracts signed, business decisions made, or intellectual property created. The lawyer stumbled through more vague language about support systems and belief and encouragement. I watched the judge's expression shift from annoyed to openly skeptical as he realized this lawsuit was exactly as frivolous as our filing claimed it was. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom silence like a knife. He dismissed the breach of contract claim first, stating there was no written agreement and no evidence that one ever existed. The quantum Merowit claim went next because Haley couldn't demonstrate any actual services she'd provided that had value to the business. I watched her lawyer's face go pale as the judge worked through each claim with clinical precision. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. The unjust enrichment claim would proceed because at this preliminary stage the court had to assume all of Haley's allegations were true. My attorney squeezed my arm and whispered that this was expected, that we'd kill it at summary judgment. But hearing the judge say one claim survived felt like losing. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I saw Haley standing near the exit with her lawyer. She was facing away from me but turned when she heard the door open. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds before she looked down at her phone and walked quickly toward the parking lot. Something about that moment hit me harder than the hearing itself. She actually believed her own story. She'd convinced herself that listening to me talk about the business over wine made her a founding partner. The delusion was so complete that she'd hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit based on nothing but her twisted version of our friendship. I stood there watching her disappear around a corner and realized I'd never really known her at all. My attorney filed the summary judgment motion 3 days later. She spent an entire afternoon walking me through the legal strategy, explaining that even if the court accepted every single thing Haley claimed as absolute truth, she still had no legal basis for recovery. Emotional support doesn't create business partnerships. Listening to someone talk doesn't entitle you to their profits. Being present during someone's journey doesn't give you ownership of their destination. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The motion was 50 pages of legal arguments backed by case law showing that friendship, no matter how Haley wanted to spin it, wasn't a contract. My attorney said we'd have a ruling within 60 days unless the judge was completely incompetent, and based on the preliminary hearing, she didn't think incompetence was the issue. The acquiring company's CEO called me 2 days after we filed the motion. I'd met him twice during negotiations, but this felt different, more personal. He told me he wasn't worried about the lawsuit affecting the deal because his legal team had reviewed everything and agreed it was nonsense. Then he shared something I hadn't expected. Years ago, when he'd sold his first company, a college friend had tried to claim he deserved equity because he'd let the CEO crash on his couch during the startup phase. The friend had actually hired a lawyer and sent threatening letters about how he'd provided housing and emotional support during the crucial early days. The CEO had learned the hard way that success brings out the worst in people who feel entitled to benefit from your work without doing any of the work themselves. He said watching me handle Haley with clear boundaries and documentation reminded him of what he wished he'd done differently. I started seeing a therapist the following week. My attorney had suggested it during one of our meetings, saying the legal battle was one thing, but processing the emotional damage was something else entirely. The therapist's office was in a building downtown with plants everywhere and soft music playing in the waiting room. I sat on her couch that first session and tried to explain how I felt about losing my oldest friend. She listened without interrupting while I talked about all the memories we'd shared, the inside jokes and late-night conversations and years of history that felt like they meant something. Then she asked me a question that changed everything. She wanted to know if I was mourning the friendship I'd actually had, or the friendship I'd believed I had. I realized I was grieving something that had never really existed. Haley's lawyer filed his response to our summary judgment motion 6 weeks later. My attorney called me laughing after she'd read it, saying it was the most unprofessional legal brief she'd seen in 15 years of practice. The whole thing was emotional arguments about the value of friendship and how modern business relationships include non-traditional contributions. He'd actually written a paragraph about how society undervalues emotional labor and women's contributions to male success, completely ignoring that I'm also a woman, and that emotional labor still isn't a legal basis for equity. My attorney said it read like a diary entry instead of legal argument, which probably meant they knew they were losing and had nothing else to work with. 4 of our mutual friends organized a dinner that week and specifically told me Haley wasn't invited. We met at a restaurant downtown, and I could feel the tension before anyone said anything. They apologized one by one for not seeing through Haley's victim act right away. One friend admitted she'd felt uncomfortable about Haley's social media posts even before the lawsuit, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Another said she'd been questioning other things about their friendship with Haley, remembering times when Haley had made everything about herself or twisted situations to play the victim. They'd all received messages from Haley asking them to talk to me, to convince me to settle, to remind me that friendship should matter more than money. Sitting there with these 4 people who'd actually stood by me felt like proof that I hadn't been crazy to fight back. My mom called that weekend with news that made me laugh out loud. Haley's mom had finally stopped texting after my mom sent her copies of the actual legal filings. Apparently reading what Haley had claimed in court, seeing it spelled out in legal language that she deserved half of a company she'd never worked for, had been too much even for her own mother. My mom said Haley's mom had responded with a short message saying she hadn't realized the full extent of what Haley was claiming and wouldn't be contacting us anymore. Even the woman who'd raised Haley and presumably wanted to support her daughter couldn't defend demanding half of someone else's company based on friendship alone. The judge's ruling on our summary judgment motion came down 8 weeks after we'd filed it. My attorney called me at work, and I could hear the smile in her voice before she said anything. The entire lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Haley couldn't refile it. The judge had written in his order that emotional support between friends, regardless of how valuable it might be personally, does not create any legal obligation to share business proceeds. He went further and awarded us attorney's fees and costs, specifically stating the lawsuit was frivolous and without merit. My attorney said the language was unusually harsh, and probably meant the judge was annoyed that this case had wasted the court's time. I sat at my desk staring at the email with the court order attached, and felt something shift inside my chest. 2 days later, Haley's lawyer filed a notice of appeal. My attorney called it a delay tactic before I could even panic about it. She explained that the ruling was legally sound and we'd win the appeal easily, but it meant another few months of this dragging on while the appellate court reviewed everything and reached the same conclusion the trial judge had. I shifted my focus to the acquisition deal, pushing through the final paperwork and negotiations with the tech company. My attorney kept me updated on the appeal status, but she was confident it wouldn't affect anything. The acquiring company's legal team did one more review of everything, checking that the lawsuit dismissal was solid and final. Their CEO called me personally to say they were impressed by how I'd handled the whole situation. He told me most entrepreneurs would have panicked or settled just to make it go away, but I'd protected the business and stood my ground. The call made me feel like I'd done something right beyond just building a good product. Over the next 3 weeks, we finalized every detail of the sale. I met with my team to explain what would happen after the acquisition, making sure everyone knew their jobs were secure and the new company valued what we'd built. Several employees pulled me aside to say they were glad I hadn't let someone take credit for work they didn't do. One of my developers told me he'd watched me code at 3 in the morning during the early days, and he knew exactly how much I'd sacrificed to build this thing. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning in a conference room downtown. I signed what felt like 100 pages while lawyers from both sides witnessed everything. When it was done, the acquiring company's CEO shook my hand and welcomed me to their advisory board. I walked out of that building knowing I had $4 million coming after all the investor payouts and taxes were processed. It wasn't enough to retire at 30, but it was real money that I'd earned myself through years of work nobody else wanted to do. The wire transfer hit my account 3 days later, and I just stared at the number on my phone screen for a solid 5 minutes. $4,200,000. Money that represented every early morning farm call, every night teaching myself to code, every restaurant pitch, every server shift where I'd been too tired to stand. I'd built something real, and someone paid me real money for it, and not a single dollar of it belonged to anyone who hadn't actually worked for it. My attorney called that same afternoon with news about the appeal. She'd filed our motion to dismiss it as frivolous, and requested additional sanctions against Haley for wasting everyone's time with meritless litigation. She sounded almost excited when she explained that we were making an example of this case because too many people think they can sue friends over imaginary claims without facing any consequences. She said the appeals court had all our documentation showing Haley's complete lack of involvement, and the trial judge's ruling had been so clear that there was basically nothing for them to overturn. I asked how long the appeal process would take, and she estimated maybe a month before we'd hear something. I spent that month setting up my financial life properly for the first time ever. I met with a financial advisor, opened investment accounts, paid off the tiny amount of debt I still had from the early business days. I put money aside for taxes, set up retirement accounts, and actually started thinking about what I wanted to do next, instead of just surviving day to day. It felt strange having breathing room after years of constant financial stress. 3 weeks and 2 days after my attorney filed the dismissal motion, she called me while I was grocery shopping. The appeals court had dismissed Haley's appeal without even requiring us to file a response brief. They'd read the trial court record, looked at our motion, and decided the whole thing was so obviously frivolous that they weren't going to waste time on oral arguments or briefs. Even better, they'd awarded us additional attorney's fees plus $15,000 in sanctions against Haley personally for pursuing litigation that had no legal merit. My attorney was practically laughing when she explained that the appeals court had used language in their order that basically called out Haley for trying to abuse the legal system. I stood in the produce section holding a bag of apples and felt this wave of satisfaction that was almost scary in its intensity. 2 days later, my attorney forwarded me an email from Haley's lawyer. He was withdrawing from representing her, effective immediately. The email was professional, but you could read between the lines that he was done working for free on a case he'd now lost twice. My attorney said most contingency lawyers will stick with an appeal if they think there's any chance of winning. But this guy had clearly realized Haley had lied to him about her actual involvement in my company. I felt a grim sort of satisfaction knowing that Haley's attempt to steal from me was now costing her money instead of making her rich. She'd have to pay our attorney's fees from both the trial and the appeal, plus the sanctions from both courts. My attorney estimated it would be around $32,000 total, and she said she'd be aggressive about collecting it, because people needed to learn that friendship lawsuits have real consequences. The payment showed up in my attorney's trust account about 10 days later. She called to tell me the check had cleared, and she was processing the final distribution to cover our fees. She mentioned that the check had come from an account with both Haley's name and her father's name on it, which meant her parents had probably paid it since Haley definitely didn't have that kind of money sitting around. I thought about Haley's mom calling my mom to guilt trip her about breaking her daughter's heart, and now Haley's own parents knew exactly what she'd tried to do. They'd seen the court documents spelling out her claims, read the judge's rulings calling the lawsuit frivolous, and then written a check for $32,000 to cover the consequences of their daughter's greed. Over the next few weeks, several mutual friends reached out to tell me what Haley was saying about everything. Apparently, she'd been complaining that the legal system was rigged in favor of rich people, that judges sided with whoever had more money, that she never had a fair chance because I could afford better lawyers. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive. She was literally trying to become rich off my work, demanding half of $12 million for doing nothing, and now she was playing victim about rich people having advantages. One friend told me Haley had posted something on social media about how the justice system protects wealth over relationships, and a bunch of people who didn't know the actual story had commented supportively. I didn't respond or engage because what was the point? The people who mattered knew the truth, and Haley could tell whatever story she needed to tell herself. I took some of my acquisition money and planned a vacation for the friends who'd actually supported me during the lawsuit. The 4 people who'd never questioned my side, who'd listened when I needed to vent, who'd reminded me I was doing the right thing when I felt guilty. I rented a beach house for a week, and we spent the time swimming and cooking and staying up late talking about everything except Haley. Nobody mentioned her name once the entire trip, which felt like the closure I needed. These were real friends who supported me without expecting anything in return, and spending time with them reminded me what actual friendship looked like. When I got back from the beach, my former tech investor called asking if I wanted to meet some other entrepreneurs he worked with. He'd been telling them about my story, both the business success and how I'd handled the lawsuit, and several people wanted to talk to me about their own early-stage companies. I started meeting with founders who were where I'd been 2 years ago, trying to figure out how to build something sustainable. I shared what I'd learned about product development, customer acquisition, team building, and how to protect yourself legally from people who might claim they deserve equity they didn't earn. Helping other people avoid my mistakes felt more meaningful than sitting around thinking about Haley's betrayal. One woman I advised was dealing with a friend who kept hinting that she deserved equity for emotional support, and I was able to walk her through exactly how to document everything and set clear boundaries before it turned into a legal mess. Watching her handle it proactively instead of reactively like I'd had to made me feel like something good had come from my experience. 6 months after the lawsuit officially ended, I ran into Haley at a coffee shop downtown. I was waiting for my order when I saw her walk in, and our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds before she literally turned around and walked back out. Part of me felt sad that our friendship had ended this way, that someone I'd known since middle school was now someone who couldn't even be in the same room as me. But mostly I felt relieved that I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to act like her minimal interest in my life had been real support, didn't have to downplay my own work to make her feel better about her choices, didn't have to maintain a friendship that had probably been one-sided for years before the lawsuit made it obvious. I grabbed my coffee and walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in months. A couple weeks after that coffee shop moment, one of our mutual friends texted me saying she'd run into Haley at a networking event. Apparently, Haley spent the whole time talking about her plans to start her own business and how she was going to be way more successful than I ever was. My friend sent me this message like she expected me to be upset or threatened, but honestly, I just felt tired. I texted back that I genuinely hoped Haley did build something successful, because maybe the process of actually creating a company from scratch would teach her what real work looked like. Maybe she'd understand why her emotional support hadn't been worth $6 million if she had to spend 2 years teaching herself skills at night after working all day, or cold calling potential clients who hung up on her, or eating ramen for months to afford server costs. My friend responded with a bunch of question marks like she couldn't believe I wasn't mad, but I meant it. The best thing that could happen to Haley would be learning the difference between watching someone build something and actually building it yourself. I started thinking about what I wanted to do next with the acquisition money. After investor payouts and taxes, I had about $4 million to work with, which was enough to fund a new venture without needing outside capital right away. I kept coming back to agricultural technology, because I'd spent 4 years building relationships with farms across 3 states, and I understood their problems better than most tech people did. The farmers I'd worked with dealt with so much inefficiency in their operations, from irrigation systems that wasted water to equipment that broke down constantly to supply chain issues that cost them money every season. I started sketching out ideas for a platform that would help farms optimize their resource usage using data analytics and sensors. Nothing fancy or complicated, just practical tools that would save them money and make their work easier. I reached out to some of the farm owners I'd gotten to know through my first company, asking if I could visit and talk about their biggest operational challenges. 3 of them invited me out within the first week, which felt like validation that I'd built real relationships during those early morning phone calls years ago. I drove out to a dairy farm about 2 hours away and spent the afternoon walking around with the owner while he explained his irrigation problems and showed me his equipment maintenance logs. He trusted me enough to share actual numbers about his costs and losses, which was exactly the kind of data I needed to build something useful. The work felt good in a way that had nothing to do with Haley or the lawsuit or any of that drama. This was just me doing what I was good at, identifying problems and figuring out solutions. A few days later, my attorney sent me a final letter officially closing out the case. She wrote that she was proud of me for standing up for myself and not backing down when Haley tried to intimidate me with legal threats. The letter said that too many people settle these friendship shakedown attempts because they feel guilty about their success, like they somehow owe other people a share of what they earned through their own work. She explained that fighting back the way I did protects everyone because it sets a precedent that you can't just demand money from successful people by claiming you provided emotional support. Her letter made me think about how many entrepreneurs probably face similar situations and just pay people off to make the problem go away. I wondered how many people had given money to friends or family members who felt entitled to their success, not because they actually deserved it, but because saying no felt too hard or too mean. My attorney ended the letter by saying I should be proud of myself for drawing clear boundaries and protecting my work, and that she hoped more people would follow my example. Reading that letter felt like permission to finally move on completely from the whole situation. I decided to write about the experience without naming Haley, or including any details that would identify her specifically. I focused on the lessons I'd learned about boundaries, about documenting everything in business relationships, about not letting guilt override common sense when people make unreasonable demands. And I wrote about how emotional support between friends is valuable and important, but it doesn't create any obligation to share business proceeds unless there was an actual agreement and actual work contribution. The post was pretty straightforward, just me sharing what happened and what I learned, but I published it on a few entrepreneur forums and subreddits where I thought it might help other people. Within 2 days, the post had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. My inbox filled up with messages from people telling me they'd dealt with almost identical situations, friends or family members who demanded money after they became successful. One woman told me her sister tried to claim ownership of her bakery because she'd taste-tested recipes during the development phase. Another person said their college roommate demanded equity in their software company because they'd let them complain about coding problems over beers. The stories were all slightly different, but the pattern was exactly the same: people who hadn't done the actual work feeling entitled to the rewards. Several people thanked me for writing about it because they'd felt alone in dealing with these situations and guilty for saying no to people they cared about. Reading all those messages made me realize how common this problem was and how few people talked about it openly. A week after the blog post went viral, I started getting emails from people asking if I'd speak at events about building businesses and handling difficult personal situations that come up when you become successful. A women's entrepreneurship group wanted me to talk at their monthly meeting. A startup incubator asked if I'd do a panel discussion about protecting yourself legally as a founder. A business school invited me to speak to their students about real-world challenges that don't get covered in classes. I said yes to all of them because I realized my experience, as painful as it had been, actually positioned me to help other people avoid similar problems or handle them better if they came up. The first speaking event was at a co-working space downtown, where about 30 women entrepreneurs gathered for the monthly meeting. I told my story without naming Haley, focusing on the specific steps I took to protect myself and the lessons I learned about documentation and boundaries. During the question period, almost every person had a story about someone in their life who felt entitled to their success. We ended up talking for an extra hour after the official meeting ended, everyone sharing experiences and advice. A journalist who'd been at that meeting contacted me a few days later, wanting to write an article about friendship breakups in business contexts. She said it was a topic that affected a lot of people, but rarely got serious coverage because everyone felt too guilty or embarrassed to talk about it publicly. I agreed to be interviewed anonymously, and she wrote this really thoughtful piece about how success can reveal the true nature of relationships that seemed solid before money got involved. The article quoted several entrepreneurs who dealt with friends demanding equity or payment for minimal contributions, and it helped normalize the conversation in a way that made people feel less alone. The journalist sent me the published article, and I read through all the comments, which were mostly people sharing their own stories or thanking her for covering the topic. Through the speaking events and the article responses, I connected with a group of about 8 women entrepreneurs who'd all dealt with people from their past demanding money after they became successful. We started meeting monthly for coffee, creating an informal support network where we could talk honestly about the challenges of success without anyone judging us for setting boundaries or protecting our work. Meeting with these women made me realize how common this pattern was, especially for women who'd been socialized our whole lives to prioritize relationships and accommodate other people's feelings over our own needs. We talked about how hard it was to say no to friends or family members, even when their demands were completely unreasonable, and how much guilt we carried for choosing our work over relationships that turned out to be conditional anyway. My new company started gaining some real traction as I developed the agricultural technology platform. I had working prototypes of the sensor systems, and I'd signed agreements with 5 farms to test the platform over the next growing season. But this time around, I was much more careful about who I discussed the business with and how much detail I shared. I'd learned that not everyone deserves access to your dreams and plans, even people you care about, because some people will use that information against you later or feel entitled to your success just because they knew about it early. I kept my circle small and only talked specifics with people who had actual expertise to contribute or skin in the game through investment or partnership. One afternoon, I got a message on LinkedIn from someone who said they used to work with Haley at her marketing firm. The message explained that Haley had been fired a few months ago for repeatedly taking credit for work other people did, claiming she'd led projects she barely contributed to, and putting her name on presentations other team members had created. The person said they'd seen my blog post and recognized the pattern immediately, and they wanted me to know that Haley's behavior with me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of how she operated in general. I sat there staring at that message for a long time, not feeling happy about Haley losing her job, but not surprised either. The pattern had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to see it clearly when we were friends. She'd always been quick to take credit and slow to do actual work, always ready to be in the photos celebrating success, but never around for the hard parts of building something. I thanked the person for reaching out and then closed LinkedIn, not wanting to think about Haley anymore. I took some of my acquisition money and started investing in other women-founded startups, wanting to support entrepreneurs who were actually doing the work and building real businesses. I wrote checks to a food delivery platform, a sustainable clothing brand, and a healthcare technology company, all founded by women who reminded me of myself a few years ago, working crazy hours and betting everything on their vision. Several of the founders told me that having an investor who understood the journey made a huge difference, someone who knew what it felt like to build something from nothing and didn't expect overnight results or easy answers. I started seeing a therapist about 3 months after the lawsuit ended, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand what had happened and make sure I learned from it. The therapist's office was in a converted brownstone with soft gray walls and plants everywhere, and during our first session, I explained the whole situation with Haley from start to finish. The therapist listened without interrupting, and then asked me what I'd learned about myself through the experience. I thought about it for a minute before answering that I'd learned I could stand up for myself even when it cost me relationships, and that felt like a strength I didn't know I had. The therapist nodded and said that many people struggle their entire lives to set boundaries because they're afraid of being seen as selfish or mean. We spent the next several sessions talking about how the lawsuit, despite being painful, actually gave me clarity about who I am and what I value. I learned that protecting my work wasn't just about money, but about respecting the effort and sacrifice that went into building something real. The therapist helped me see that Haley's lawsuit was probably the clearest gift she could have given me because it forced me to stop pretending our friendship was something it wasn't. Around the same time, I reconnected with some friends from my waitressing days who'd seen me during the building phase. I met 3 of them for dinner at the same restaurant where we'd all worked together, and walking through the doors brought back memories of coming in for lunch shifts exhausted from coding all night. We sat at a booth in the back, and they asked about the company sale and the situation with Haley, which they'd heard about through mutual connections. I gave them the short version, and they all shook their heads saying they weren't surprised Haley had pulled something like that. One of them, Sarah, said she remembered how I used to bring my laptop to work and code during slow periods while Haley would come by for free appetizers and complain about her office job. Another friend mentioned that they'd always known I'd succeed because they saw the dedication and sacrifice firsthand, watching me work doubles to save money for server costs and skip staff drinks to go home and work on the app. Hearing their perspective made me realize that the people who actually witnessed my work never questioned what I'd earned. Only the people who saw the finished product thought success came easy. A year after the lawsuit ended, I was in a completely different place mentally and emotionally. I had stronger boundaries with everyone in my life, not just about business, but about my time and energy in general. I'd developed better judgment about people, learning to watch what they did rather than believing what they said. My confidence in handling difficult situations had grown because I'd faced the worst-case scenario of someone I loved trying to destroy me, and I'd survived it. I looked at my life and saw that I'd built something real again with the new company, but this time I was surrounded by people who actually contributed, rather than people who just wanted to be associated with success. The difference was obvious in every interaction, from how my team communicated to how investors engaged with the business. I started each day feeling grateful for the clarity the lawsuit had given me, rather than bitter about what I'd lost. My new company raised a significant seed round 6 months into development, bringing in $2 million from a group of investors who did serious research before committing. During the final pitch meeting, one of the lead investors mentioned that they'd looked into the Haley situation as part of their background check on me. I felt my stomach drop thinking this might hurt the deal, but the investor said it actually gave them more confidence in my leadership. He explained that how I handled the lawsuit demonstrated character and business judgment, showing I could make hard decisions and protect company assets even under emotional pressure. Another investor added that too many founders let personal relationships cloud their business sense, and my willingness to fight a frivolous lawsuit rather than just paying to make it go away showed the kind of backbone they wanted in a CEO. The lead investor said they'd seen plenty of successful first-time founders who struggled with their second venture because they got soft or lost their edge, but my track record showed I was getting sharper and more focused. We closed the round 2 weeks later, and I used part of the money to hire my first employees for the new venture. I was deliberate about building a healthy company culture from the start, learning from both the successes and mistakes of my first company. I interviewed candidates carefully, asking about their work style and what kind of environment helped them do their best work. I hired 5 people in the first wave, all of them experienced in agricultural technology or software development, and I made sure each person understood exactly what they were signing up for. During the offer process, I shared equity appropriately with people who actually contributed, giving each early employee a meaningful stake in the company based on their role and expected impact. Setting up the equity structure felt like reclaiming the concept from Haley's distortion of it, proving that sharing ownership made sense when people actually built something together. My new team started work in a small office space near the university, and within the first month I could tell we had something special based on how people collaborated and pushed each other to do better work. One afternoon, I got coffee with one of the mutual friends who'd stayed neutral during the lawsuit, and she mentioned that Haley had moved to a different city about 6 months ago. The friend said Haley seemed to be doing okay based on her social media, working at a new company and posting pictures of her apartment and new neighborhood. I felt genuinely neutral hearing the update, not happy or sad or curious about details. I told my friend I hoped Haley was happy, but I had no desire to reconnect or know more about her life. The friend nodded and said she understood, then changed the subject to talk about her own work situation. Walking back to my office after coffee, I realized that true healing wasn't about forgiving Haley or understanding her perspective. It was about reaching a place where she simply didn't matter to my life anymore. I spoke at a conference about building sustainable businesses 3 months later, presenting to a room of about 200 entrepreneurs and investors. My talk focused on the practical challenges of scaling agricultural technology and the importance of building real relationships with farmers, rather than just treating them as data points. During the question session, someone in the back row asked how I dealt with the friendship lawsuit they'd read about in the business press. The room got quiet, and I could feel everyone leaning forward waiting for my answer. I said honestly that it was painful but necessary, and that protecting your work isn't selfish even when people try to make you feel guilty about it. I explained that the lawsuit taught me to document everything and be clear about who contributes what, which made me a better business partner and leader. The person who asked nodded, and several other people came up afterward to share their own stories of friends or family members who felt entitled to their success. My mom called me a few weeks after the conference and said she wanted to talk about something that had been on her mind. We met for lunch at a place near her house, and she told me she was proud of how I handled everything with Haley. She admitted that initially she thought I should just give Haley some money to preserve the friendship, maybe $50,000 or $100,000 to avoid the legal battle and keep the peace. I asked what changed her mind, and she said that watching the lawsuit unfold made her understand that the friendship was already broken, and Haley's legal action just made it visible. My mom said she'd been thinking about all the times over the years when Haley made everything about herself, and she realized the pattern had always been there, but we'd all excused it because that's what you do with old friends. She said she was sorry for initially pressuring me to settle, and that she understood now why I fought back. I started mentoring a young entrepreneur named Jessica, who reached out through a mutual connection asking for advice. We met at a coffee shop, and she explained that her best friend from college was demanding equity in the business Jessica had built, claiming she deserved ownership because she'd been supportive during the early days. The situation was so similar to mine that I almost laughed, but instead I asked Jessica to walk me through exactly what her friend had contributed versus what Jessica had done herself. Jessica listed out all her own work, and then admitted her friend had basically just listened to her talk about the business occasionally while they hung out. I gave her concrete advice about documentation, showing her how to compile evidence of her actual solo work and her friend's lack of contribution. I explained the importance of boundaries and not letting guilt override business sense, sharing specific examples from my own experience with Haley. Jessica left the meeting looking relieved and determined, and 3 weeks later she texted me that she'd offered her friend nothing, and the friend had backed down after seeing the documentation. Helping her avoid my mistakes felt meaningful in a way that surprised me. 2 years after the acquisition, my new company was thriving with 15 employees, partnerships with over 100 farms and revenue that exceeded our projections. I was surrounded by people who actually supported my work, rather than just wanting to benefit from it. People who showed up early and stayed late because they believed in what we were building. I'd built a professional network based on mutual respect and genuine contribution, where people helped each other because they valued the relationship, not because they expected a payout. Looking at my team during our weekly meeting, I felt grateful for the hard lessons I'd learned with Haley, because they taught me to recognize real support versus performative friendship. My life was fuller and more successful than it had been before the lawsuit, not despite what happened with Haley, but partly because of it. I went 3 months without thinking about Haley at all, which surprised me when I realized it. She came up during a mentorship call with a young founder who was dealing with a similar situation, and I had to actually pause to remember the details of what happened. The whole thing felt like something that happened to a different version of me, someone younger and less sure of herself. I shared the story with this founder as a cautionary tale about documentation and boundaries, using specific examples of what I did right and what I wish I'd done differently. She took notes and thanked me for being honest about how much it hurt at the time, and I realized that was true healing, turning pain into something useful for someone else. The lawsuit and the friendship ending still mattered in my story, but they didn't define me anymore or take up space in my head unless I deliberately brought them up to help someone. The email from the journalist came on a Tuesday morning asking if I'd be willing to be profiled for a major business publication. My new company had hit some impressive milestones, and they wanted to feature me in their emerging entrepreneurs section. I said yes and spent an hour on the phone walking through my journey from waitressing to my first exit to building this second company. The journalist asked about challenges and setbacks, and I mentioned the difficulty of the acquisition process and learning to scale quickly, but the Haley situation never came up. When the article published 2 weeks later, it mentioned my previous successful exit in one sentence as background context, focusing instead on my current work in agricultural technology and my approach to building sustainable businesses. The whole piece was about my work, my vision, my team, the problems we were solving. No drama, no betrayal, no lawsuits. Just a founder who built something valuable, sold it, and was building something new. I sent the article to my mom, and she texted back 3 heart emojis and said she was proud of how far I'd come. I booked a solo trip to Iceland for the week of my company anniversary. 3 years since I'd started building that first app in my tiny apartment while working double shifts. I wanted to do something meaningful to mark the occasion, something that was just for me. I spent 5 days hiking through volcanic landscapes and soaking in hot springs, thinking about everything that happened in those 3 years. The early mornings cold calling farms, the rejection from restaurants who thought the idea wouldn't work, the first time I saw my app actually save someone money. The investor meeting that changed everything, hiring my first employee, watching the business grow beyond what I'd imagined. Then the acquisition offer, Haley showing up with her lawyer, the lawsuit, the appeals, finally winning. Starting over with this new company, building a team I trusted, learning from my mistakes. The journey included betrayal and loss, moments where I questioned everything, times I wanted to give up. But it also taught me strength I didn't know I had, showed me how to protect my work, helped me understand the difference between real support and people who just wanted to benefit from my success. I came back from that trip feeling settled in a way I hadn't before, grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Sitting in my office 6 months later looking at photos from that Iceland trip on my wall, I thought about Haley for the first time in weeks. I was grateful I'd offered her exactly what she gave me, which was nothing, because it forced both of us to be honest about what our friendship actually was. She wanted credit for my work without doing the work, wanted to benefit from my success without supporting the struggle, wanted half of something she never helped build. Fighting back instead of giving in to guilt taught me to set boundaries and protect what I created. I lost a friendship, but I kept my integrity and my self-respect. Now I was surrounded by people who genuinely supported me, who showed up when things were hard, not just when things were successful, who celebrated my wins without asking what they'd get out of it. My business partner, my team, my real friends, the mentors who gave me actual advice. These were the people who belonged in my life. The lawsuit cost me money and time and emotional energy, but it gave me clarity about who I was and what I valued. I built a life and a career on my own terms, with people who respected my work instead of trying to claim it as their own. And that's the takeaway for this one. I love when small stories remind us how much we can still learn. If this one made you pause and think, that's all I could hope for.